She accidentally slapped the most feared mafia boss in Seoul right in the middle of a crowded VIP lounge.
From everyone else.
His bodyguards drew their guns to execute her on the spot, until the boss raised his hand, felt his burning cheek, and ordered his men to protect her from everyone else. The club sat 3 floors beneath a nondescript high-rise in Gangnam, the kind of place that didn't exist unless you knew the right password and the right face to show at the door. Juliet had both. 6 months of digging had earned her a fake identity, a borrowed invitation, and a press badge sewn into the lining of her clutch. Tonight, wearing a sleek emerald green gown that hugged every curve and her long box braids swept over one shoulder, she looked like she belonged among the diamonds and cigar smoke. She did not feel like she belonged. She felt like a woman standing at the edge of something with teeth. The lounge was all dark wood paneling and tufted purple velvet, low amber sconces throwing gold across a room full of people who trafficked in secrets, and, if her sources were right, in something far worse. Somewhere in this room, men were finalizing the sale of human beings like they were finalizing a wine order. She just needed 30 more seconds of audio. She never got them. A hand closed around her shoulder from behind, hard and sudden, fingers digging in through silk. Every nerve in her body screamed threat. 2 years of self-defense drills took over before her mind caught up. She pivoted on her heel, planted her weight, and swung. The crack of her palm against flesh rang out over the low thrum of the music. The room went silent so fast it felt like the air itself had been switched off. Juliet's hand was still raised when she saw his face. Not her attacker. Not some hired thug reaching for her purse. A man in a tailored charcoal 3-piece suit and a fitted black dress shirt, a silver lapel pin catching the light, his sharply styled dark hair immaculate even now. He was leaning back slightly, one hand rising slowly to touch his own reddening cheek, where the unmistakable print of her fingers was already blooming red against his skin. Cho Yang Yun. Leader of the Biko syndicate. The one name every source she'd interviewed had refused to say above a whisper. Juliet's hands flew to her mouth, eyes wide with horror, chest rising and falling in short panicked breaths. Around them, clubgoers in formal evening wear stared, glasses frozen halfway to their lips, mouths open in silent shock. Yang Yun's bodyguards moved as one, tall, broad men in black suits and white shirts, coiled earpiece wires disappearing into their collars, hands already sliding toward their jackets. One stepped forward, ready to end this before it became a story anyone lived to tell. Yang Yun raised his left hand, palm out. His men froze mid-motion. He studied her, not with fury, but with something sharper. Curiosity. Recognition. Behind her, at the edge of the crowd, a shape stiffened and began to retreat toward the shadows near the private booths, a hand already dipping into a jacket pocket. Yang Yun's eyes flicked past Juliet's shoulder for half a second, and something in his expression hardened into certainty. He looked back at her, at the terror and fire still warring in her face, and said the words that would upend both their lives. Nobody touches her. Protect her from everyone else. Juliet had learned to read a room the way other people read headlines, fast, instinctive, and always looking for the lie underneath. The Gangnam club she'd talked her way into that night was full of them. 3 weeks of cultivating a source inside the Ministry of Trade had gotten her a name, a date, and a floor number. Tonight, on that floor, 4 men who controlled shipping manifests for half the ports on the peninsula were meeting with a woman known only as the broker. Juliet's source swore the meeting wasn't about trade at all. It was about cargo that breathed. She'd dressed for the part, emerald silk, gold hoops, a clutch with a false bottom holding a recorder no bigger than a lipstick tube. The invitation in her hand had cost her contact 2 months of surveillance and a favor she didn't want to think too hard about. The bouncer at the private elevator barely glanced at it before waving her through, and then she was rising, floor by floor, into a world that smelled like leather and old money and something colder underneath. The VIP level was a hushed cathedral of velvet booths and low gold light, music thrumming just loud enough to swallow conversation from anyone not standing close enough to matter. Juliet drifted along the edges of the room the way she'd trained herself to. Never rushing, never lingering, a woman who belonged to no one and therefore belonged everywhere. She spotted the booth her source had described, tucked behind a half-wall of dark wood lattice, and angled herself near enough to catch the murmur of voices without catching a single curious glance. She caught fragments. Numbers. A shipping route through Incheon. A phrase that made her stomach drop, product intake, next lunar cycle, spoken as casually as a lunch order. Her thumb found the recorder's hidden switch inside her clutch and pressed. 30 seconds, she told herself. She only needed 30 seconds of this to hand to the right editor, the right prosecutor, the right anyone who might actually do something. She never got to 20. It was a shift in the air first, a presence at her back, too close, too deliberate to be a stranger drifting past. Every hair on her arms rose. Her pulse spiked into her throat. In the 2 years since a man had followed her home from a story in D.C. and put his hands where they didn't belong, Juliet had spent countless Saturday mornings in a cramped studio learning how not to be a victim twice. A hand closed over her shoulder, fingers digging in hard enough to spin her. She didn't think. She moved. Her body pivoted on the ball of her heel, weight dropping low the way her instructor had drilled into her 100 times, and her palm came around in a wide, vicious arc, connecting with a crack that seemed to detonate through the entire room. The silence that followed was absolute. The music didn't fade, it simply stopped, as if someone had reached out and closed a fist around the sound itself. Juliet's arm was still extended, her palm still stinging, when her eyes finally landed on the man in front of her, and the floor seemed to tilt beneath her heels. He was not the leering stranger she'd braced for. He was tall, composed, dressed in a charcoal three-piece suit so precisely tailored it looked poured onto him, a black dress shirt open at the collar, a small silver pin catching the light at his lapel. His hair was dark and sharply combed, his jaw set in an expression that hovered somewhere between disbelief and something far more dangerous. His hand rose slowly to his cheek, where her handprint was already blooming an angry red against his skin. Every face in the club had turned toward them. Somewhere behind her, glass met a table too hard, spilling amber liquid nobody moved to clean. "Oh my God," Juliet breathed, her hands flying to her mouth, horror crashing over her in a wave. She knew that face. She'd seen it in 3 different intelligence briefings, always accompanied by words like ruthless and untouchable and do not approach. Cho Yang Yun, the head of the Biko syndicate. The man whose name alone made seasoned detectives lower their voices. She had just slapped him across the face in front of half of Seoul's criminal elite. Movement erupted around them, not chaos, but something worse, something precise. 4 men in black suits closed in from different angles, hands already inside their jackets, faces utterly without mercy. Juliet's mind screamed at her to run, but her heels felt nailed to the marble floor, her whole body frozen in the wreckage of what she'd just done. "Sir," one of the bodyguards said, low and clipped, already reaching for her arm. "Give the word." Yang Yun didn't answer immediately. His fingers stayed pressed to his cheek, and his dark eyes moved over her. Not with fury, she realized with dawning confusion, but with something closer to fascination, like he was recalculating everything he thought he understood about the next 5 minutes of his life. Then, for the briefest instant, his gaze flicked past her shoulder, toward the shadowed edge of the room where a figure in a waiter's jacket had gone very still, one hand drifting toward the folded napkin over his forearm in a way that had nothing to do with serving drinks. Something shifted in Yang Yun's expression. Recognition. Calculation. The kind of stillness that came right before a man made a decision that would matter. He lowered his hand from his cheek and raised it instead, palm out, toward his men. They stopped as if a switch had been thrown. "Sir," the same bodyguard pressed, visibly straining against the order. "Take her out. Now." Through the east corridor. Yang Yun's voice was quiet, but it moved through the room like a blade through silk. Nobody in that lounge would have dreamed of questioning it. His eyes found Juliet's again, and for a moment the noise of the club, the stairs, the sheer impossibility of what was happening all fell away, narrowed down to the 2 of them and the red mark still burning on his cheek. "Nobody touches her. Not the men behind you. Not anyone in this room." protect her from all of it. Juliet barely had time to process the words before hands, careful, controlled, but utterly immovable, closed around her arms and began moving her toward a door she hadn't even noticed was there, hidden behind a black curtain near the back of the lounge. She twisted to look over her shoulder, some instinct demanding she keep her eyes on the danger rather than let it vanish behind her. Yang Yun hadn't moved. He stood in the wreckage of frozen glasses and gaping guests, one hand now pressed flat against the table for balance, watching her go with an expression she couldn't begin to name. Behind him, she caught a last glimpse of the waiter in the black jacket melting backward into the crowd, his hand slipping out of his napkin empty, his face flickering with something that looked almost like frustration. Then the curtain fell shut behind her, and the club, the danger, the astonished silence of 200 strangers, all disappeared behind black velvet. The corridor beyond was narrow and unmarked, lit by a single strip of blue emergency lighting along the floor. Two of the bodyguards flanked her without a word, moving fast, their pace leaving no room for questions. Juliet's mind raced through a dozen possibilities: arrest, ransom, worse, but none of them explained the strange, deliberate gentleness of the hands steering her, the careful way they kept her angled between their bodies as if she were something precious rather than a prisoner. "Where are you taking me?" she finally demanded, digging her heels in as they reached a service elevator gleaming with brushed steel. "Somewhere safe," the taller bodyguard said, his tone flat, professional, entirely unmoved by her tone. "Please, miss. Get in." "I am not getting into an elevator with." "There is a man with a rifle on the rooftop across the street," the second bodyguard interrupted, his voice dropping lower, quicker. "He has had a line on this exit for the last 4 minutes. If you would like to discuss your options with him instead, please, take your time." Juliet's mouth snapped shut. She got in the elevator. They descended in silence, the numbers ticking downward past floors that shouldn't have existed on any building directory she'd studied before tonight. When the doors finally opened, it was onto an underground garage, sleek black SUVs lined up in a neat row, engines already idling. She was ushered into the middle vehicle of 3, sandwiched between the same 2 guards, the doors sealing shut with a heavy, reinforced thunk that told her these cars weren't built for comfort. They were built to survive. The convoy pulled out into the Seoul night, weaving through backstreets Juliet didn't recognize, cutting through alleys too narrow for 2 cars to pass side by side. She caught glimpses of the city sliding past through tinted glass. Neon signs, late-night food stalls, ordinary people living ordinary lives, utterly unaware that somewhere behind these blackened windows, a woman who'd struck the head of the Biko syndicate was being spirited away into the dark heart of his world. Nearly 40 minutes later, the convoy slowed at a gate flanked by high stone walls and cameras angled in every direction. Juliet watched as the gate rolled open in eerie silence, revealing a sprawling estate lit by soft floodlights. Manicured gardens, a modern glass and stone mansion that looked more like a fortress dressed up as architecture, guards stationed at intervals along the perimeter like sentries in some private war. The car came to a stop beneath a covered entrance, and the door beside her opened before she'd even reached for the handle. "This way, please," the taller guard said, extending a hand she didn't take. Juliet stepped out on unsteady legs, staring up at the building looming above her, every window dark except for a single lit room on the 2nd floor. Somewhere behind those walls, she understood with sudden, bone-deep clarity, was the man whose face she'd marked with her own hand, and whatever came next, there would be no talking her way out of it with a fake press badge and a borrowed invitation. She was led through a series of hallways that felt more like an art gallery than a criminal stronghold, dark wood, clean lines, the occasional sculpture standing sentinel in alcoves lit from below. No one spoke to her. No one explained anything. By the time they reached a set of double doors at the end of a long corridor, Juliet's nerves had stretched so thin she nearly flinched when they swung open on silent hinges. The room beyond was a study, all towering bookshelves and a wall of glass overlooking the dark sprawl of gardens outside. Cho Yang Yun stood near the window, his jacket removed now, sleeves rolled to the forearm, a glass of something amber untouched on the desk beside him. The mark on his cheek had faded to a dull pink, but she could still see the shape of her hand there, and something in her chest twisted with an emotion she refused to call guilt. He turned as she entered, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "You may leave us," he said finally, and the guards at her back withdrew without a sound, the doors clicking shut behind them. "I want to go home," Juliet said, before he could speak again, before her own fear could talk her out of it. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Whatever this is, kidnapping, ransom, some kind of message you're trying to send someone, I'm not worth whatever trouble I'm about to cause you. Let me go, and I'll forget any of this happened." "You're a journalist," Yang Yun said, not a question. "Investigating trafficking through the port routes. You've been tracking the brokers' meetings for weeks." Juliet's blood went cold. "I don't know what you're talking about. Your recorder is still in your clutch, which my men returned to you untouched." His eyes flicked, briefly, to the bag now clutched against her side. "You should thank whoever trained you in self-defense, Ms. Adeyemi. That reflex of yours is the only reason you're alive tonight." Hearing her own name in his mouth sent a fresh jolt of fear through her, but she forced her spine straight, refusing to let it show. "You know who I am." "Good. Then you know I have people who'll come looking if I disappear." "I'm certain you do." Something almost like amusement flickered across his face before vanishing. "But you're not going to disappear, Ms. Adeyemi. You're going to stay here, under my protection, until the man who tried to kill you tonight is no longer in a position to try again." Juliet blinked. "Kill me? Nobody tried to kill me. I slapped a stranger in a nightclub and got kidnapped for it." "You slapped me," Yang Yun corrected, "because a man dressed as waitstaff was 1.5 meters behind you with a silenced sidearm drawn beneath a folded napkin. He'd been tracking you for the better part of an hour, waiting for a clean angle. When you spun and struck me, you broke his line by half a step and gave my security detail the half-second they needed to identify him. If you hadn't reacted the way you did, you would have had a bullet in the base of your skull before you ever heard my name." The room seemed to tilt around her. Juliet's hand found the back of a nearby chair, gripping hard enough to whiten her knuckles. "That's," she started, then stopped, because the alternative explanation, that this was all an elaborate lie designed to control her, felt suddenly, sickeningly thin against the memory of that hand closing on her shoulder, that strange proximity she'd never questioned in the terror of the moment. "Park Min-soo," Yang Yun continued, watching her absorb it, "runs the rival syndicate that controls the trafficking routes you've been investigating. He's known about your work for over a month. Tonight was meant to end it, quietly, in a room full of witnesses too frightened to ever speak of what they saw." "I was standing where I needed to be to draw his shooter's attention," Yang Yun said. "I didn't anticipate the slap. I'll admit that much. Despite everything, the fear, the disorientation, the sheer impossibility of the last hour, something in Juliet's chest wanted, absurdly, to laugh. She swallowed it down. "So what happens now? I sit in your very nice fortress and say thank you for my kidnapping?" "You stay here," Yang Yun said, "where Park Min-soo's people cannot reach you, until I've dealt with the immediate threat to your life. After that, what you do with your freedom is your own business. And if I walk out that door right now? Then I won't stop you," he said, and something in his voice told her it was true. "But you'll be dead within 24 hours, and every piece of evidence you've gathered will die with you." He paused, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away and refuse to. "I don't think you're the kind of woman who lets that happen without a fight." Juliet held his gaze, her mind racing through every possible angle, every escape route, every reason this could still be a trap dressed up as rescue. But underneath the fear, a different instinct was stirring. The same one that had gotten her into that club in the first place, the one that smelled a story too big to walk away from. "Fine," she said finally. "I'll stay. But I'm not your prisoner, and I'm not your guest. The second this stops making sense, I'm gone, sniper or no sniper." Something that might have been respect flickered across Yang Yun's face. "Agreed," he said, and reached for the glass on the desk, finally taking a slow drink, as if the matter were settled. Juliet spent the next 2 days learning the shape of her captivity. The estate was beautiful in the way expensive things often were, cold, precise, built to intimidate as much as to impress. She was given a suite on the 3rd floor with a view of the gardens, a wardrobe of clothes in her exact size that she refused to examine too closely for how they'd gotten her measurements, and 2 guards stationed permanently outside her door, whose presence she alternately resented and, in her more honest moments, found strangely reassuring. By the 3rd morning, restlessness had curdled into something sharper. She found Yang Yun in the same study, going over a tablet of documents with the quiet focus of a man used to holding entire empires in his head. "I'm not going to sit here decorating your guest room," she announced, closing the door behind her without waiting for permission. He didn't look up immediately. "You're welcome to use the library. Or the pool, if you'd prefer." "I have 8 months of research on Park Min-soo's trafficking network," Juliet said, ignoring the offer entirely. "Shipping manifests, financial records, 3 corroborating sources inside the port's authority. It's the most complete file that exists outside a federal database, and I'm the only person who knows where all the pieces connect." That got his attention. He set the tablet down slowly. "And you're telling me this because?" "Because I want out of here, and I'm guessing you want Park Min-soo gone even more than I want my freedom." She crossed her arms, refusing to let her nerves show in her posture. "I give you my files. Full access, everything I built. In exchange, you get me somewhere safe with actual jurisdiction, an embassy, a police station with names I trust, anywhere outside your reach, the moment the immediate threat is handled." Yang Yun studied her for a long moment, something calculating moving behind his dark eyes. "You'd trust a crime boss with evidence that could end careers, topple companies, expose networks that reach into government offices?" "I don't trust you," Juliet said flatly. "I trust that you want Park Min-soo destroyed badly enough to actually use what I give you instead of burying it." A faint, humorless smile touched his mouth. "You're not wrong about that." He rose from behind the desk, moving to the window, hands clasped loosely behind his back, and for a moment he looked less like the head of a criminal empire and more like a man carrying something heavy he rarely set down. 14 years ago, my younger sister disappeared from a market 3 blocks from our family's restaurant. She was 17. The police called it a runaway case and closed the file within a month." His voice stayed level, controlled, but something underneath it had gone very still. "I spent 6 years searching before I found what actually happened to her. She'd been taken by a trafficking network that used the exact shipping routes your files describe. By the time I found proof, she was already gone." Juliet's arms slowly uncrossed, the sharp edges of her suspicion softening despite herself. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, and meant it. "I didn't take control of the Biko syndicate for power," Yang Yun continued, turning back to face her. "I took it because it was the only structure large enough, connected enough, ruthless enough to dismantle a network like the one that took her. Piece by piece, from the inside, in ways no police force or journalist ever could alone. Park Min-soo inherited half of what used to be a unified organization. He kept the trafficking operations my faction spent years trying to bury. I've spent 3 years quietly cutting off his routes, his buyers, his protection inside the ministry. Your files would let me finish it in months instead of years." Juliet studied his face, searching for the lie she'd expected to find and coming up empty. Whatever else Cho Yang Yun was, and she had no illusions that meant good, not by any definition she'd have used a week ago, the grief in his voice when he spoke of his sister was not something she thought a man could fake, not with that particular weight behind it. "Then we have a deal," she said. "My files, your resources. We take him down together." "There are conditions," Yang Yun said. "You remain here, under guard, until the operation is complete. No leaving the estate without an escort. No contact with your newsroom until we've confirmed there's no leak on your end." Juliet's jaw tightened. "There's no leak. I trust my editor completely." "You trusted a stranger's hand on your shoulder too, until you didn't," Yang Yun said, not unkindly, and the words landed harder than she wanted to admit. Humor me. For your own safety. She held his gaze a long moment, then exhaled, some of the fight draining out of her posture. Fine. But this is a partnership, not a hostage situation. I want updates. I want a say in how my material gets used. And the second Park Min-soo is finished, you put me on the fastest route out of here you've got. Agreed, Yang Yun said, and for the first time since the club, something like an actual understanding passed between them, fragile, uneasy, but real. The alliance held for 4 days, long enough for Juliet to hand over encrypted copies of her files, long enough for her to start recognizing the guards' faces and the estate's rhythms, long enough that the fear humming beneath her ribs had begun, treacherously, to soften into something like routine. It was well past midnight on the 5th night when the first gunshot shattered that fragile calm. Juliet jolted upright in bed at the sound, heart slamming, every nerve firing at once. A second shot followed, closer, then the low, guttural crackle of an alarm system engaging somewhere deep in the walls of the estate. Her door burst open before she'd even found her feet, and one of her usual guards filled the frame, his composed professionalism replaced by something raw and urgent. We're under attack. Move, now. She didn't argue. She grabbed the robe from the foot of her bed and followed him into the hallway, where chaos had already taken hold. Guards sprinting past with weapons drawn, shouted commands in clipped Korean she only half understood, the distant crash of glass breaking somewhere on the ground floor. The guard steered her hard to the left, away from the main staircase, toward a service corridor she'd never been shown. They made it 3 steps before a figure in black tactical gear rounded the corner ahead of them, weapon already rising. Everything happened at once. The guard shoved Juliet bodily behind him, his own weapon coming up a half-second too late, and then Yang Yun was there, appearing from a side passage like he'd been waiting for exactly this. Closing the distance in 2 strides and driving the attacker's gun arm wide with a brutal, economical strike before the man could fire. The shot went wild into the ceiling, plaster raining down, and Yang Yun followed the disarm with a second blow that dropped the intruder to the floor in a boneless heap. He didn't pause to admire the work. His eyes found Juliet instantly, scanning her for injury with an intensity that startled her even through her own terror. Are you hurt? No. I'm fine, she managed, though her voice shook. Stay behind me. Do not leave my side. He didn't wait for her agreement before moving, pulling her along the corridor with a grip that was firm but careful, angling his own body between her and every doorway, every blind corner they passed. Another attacker emerged from a side room and Yang Yun met him without breaking stride, a flurry of movement too fast for Juliet to fully track, ending with the man crumpled against a wall and Yang Yun's knuckles split and bleeding. Who are these people? Juliet gasped as they pressed on, the sound of gunfire still echoing from somewhere below. Park Min-soo found this location faster than I expected, Yang Yun bit out, and for the first time she heard something like genuine alarm beneath his control. He's not trying to kill me tonight. He's trying to kill you, in my own house, so it looks like I couldn't protect what I promised to. They reached a junction where the corridor split, one path leading toward what Juliet assumed was the estate's control room, the other toward an exterior door half obscured by a tapestry. Before Yang Yun could choose a direction, 3 more figures appeared at the far end of the passage, weapons already trained. Yang Yun shoved Juliet hard into an alcove behind a decorative column, his own body a wall between her and the line of fire. Stay down, he ordered, and then he was moving again, meeting the first attacker head-on with nothing but his hands and a speed that seemed almost inhuman, disarming, striking, using the narrow corridor itself as a weapon to keep his enemies from surrounding him. Juliet pressed herself into the alcove, heart hammering, and her eyes caught on something half hidden by the tapestry beside her. A small recessed panel with a keypad and a single red switch beneath a clear plastic guard, a label in both Korean and English, emergency lockdown, authorized personnel only. She didn't hesitate. Journalism had taught her to read systems fast, to find the lever that mattered in a crisis before anyone else noticed it existed. She flipped the guard up and slammed her palm against the switch. Steel shutters crashed down over every window and exterior door in the wing with a deafening, grinding roar, sealing the corridor's far end and trapping one of the remaining attackers on the wrong side of a solid barrier before he could reach his companion. The sudden isolation gave Yang Yun the half-second he needed to finish the second man and turn on the third, who now found himself alone, cut off from backup, his confidence visibly crumbling. It was over in under a minute. Yang Yun stood breathing hard amid three unconscious bodies, blood on his knuckles, his shirt torn at the shoulder, and turned to find Juliet already stepping out from the alcove, pale but steady on her feet. "You triggered the lockdown," he said, something between disbelief and something warmer moving across his face. "I saw a big red emergency switch during a firefight," Juliet said, her voice trembling despite her attempt at composure. "Seemed like a reasonable moment to press it." From further down the corridor, one of Yang Yun's senior bodyguards came limping into view, one arm pressed tight against a bleeding wound at his side, his face gray with pain but alive. Very much alive, Juliet realized, because the same lockdown that had sealed off his attacker's escape had also sealed him safely on the correct side of the barrier before the man could finish what he'd started. "She saved Tae-hoon," the bodyguard's partner said quietly, arriving a step behind him, staring at Juliet with something close to astonishment. The switch cut off his attacker mid-strike. Yang Yun's eyes moved from his injured man to Juliet, and whatever careful distance he'd maintained between them since the club seemed, for one unguarded moment, to crack entirely open. "You're a reporter," he said, quiet, almost wondering. "Not a soldier." "I told you," Juliet said, her voice steadier now, even as her hands shook at her sides, "I don't sit idly by." He crossed the distance between them before either of them seemed to fully register the movement, and for a moment neither spoke, the silence heavy with everything that had just happened and everything it meant. Then he reached out, gently, and brushed a fleck of plaster dust from her shoulder, his hand lingering half a second longer than the gesture required. "We need to move you to a second location before dawn," he said, his voice rougher than before. "This one isn't safe anymore." "Then let's move," Juliet said, and if her voice shook only slightly on the words, neither of them mentioned it. The second estate sat farther from the city, tucked into a fold of mountains an hour north of Seoul, ringed by pine forest and a security perimeter Yang Yun's men had swept twice before allowing Juliet through the gates. She hadn't slept. Adrenaline had carried her through the drive, but by the time she was shown into a private wing overlooking a dark valley, it had drained out of her all at once, leaving her hands unsteady and a shallow cut along her forearm throbbing where she'd caught it against the alcove wall during the firefight. She sat on the edge of an unfamiliar bed, staring at her phone, and finally did the one thing she'd been putting off since the attack. She called her editor. Marcus picked up on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep and, underneath it, something she would later understand was fear of a very different kind. "Juliet? Christ, where have you been? I've had people asking questions." "I was almost killed tonight," she said flatly, watching his reaction more than listening to his words. "Twice, actually, if you count the club." A pause. "Too long. Too careful." "What club?" "The one you told me to go to alone," Juliet said, and something in her chest went cold and still even as she said it. "The one where a man was waiting behind me with a silenced pistol before I'd even finished setting up my recorder." "You've never sent me into a location that hot without backup, Marcus." "Not once in 3 years." The silence on the line stretched long enough that she had her answer before he ever spoke again. "You don't understand the position I was in," he said finally, his voice dropping into something pleading and ugly all at once. "They had my brother's gambling debts. They had, Juliet, you have to understand, it wasn't personal." She ended the call before he could finish the sentence, her hand shaking so badly the phone nearly slipped from her fingers. 3 years. 3 years of trusting him with sources, with her safety, with the shape of her entire career, and he had sold her address and her assignment to the very network she was trying to expose, packaged up and handed over like a debt paid in someone else's blood. She didn't cry. She wanted to, some far-off part of her noted almost clinically, but the tears wouldn't come, only a hollow, furious grief for every year she'd spent believing she had someone in that newsroom who had her back. There was a soft knock at the door. She hadn't realized how long she'd been sitting there in silence until Yang Yun's voice came, quiet, careful not to intrude. "May I come in?" She didn't trust her voice, so she simply nodded, then remembered he couldn't see that through the door and managed a rough, "Yeah." He entered carrying a small medical kit, his torn shirt changed for a plain black one, the split skin across his knuckles cleaned but not yet bandaged. He took one look at her face and set the kit down on the small table beside the bed without a word, sitting on the edge of a chair angled toward her. "Your arm," he said simply, nodding to the cut along her forearm. She let him take her wrist, too exhausted to argue, and watched as he cleaned the wound with a gentleness that felt strange coming from hands she'd just watched break 3 armed men in under a minute. His touch was careful, methodical, his focus entirely on the task, and for a while neither of them spoke. "My editor," she said finally, her voice cracking despite her best effort to keep it steady. "He sent me into that club knowing what would happen. He sold me out to pay off a debt." Yang Yun's hand stilled for a moment on her arm before continuing their work. "I'm sorry," he said, and there was no performance in it, none of the careful diplomacy she'd started to expect from him. Just quiet, plain honesty. "I don't have anywhere else," Juliet admitted, the words costing her more than she expected. "No editor I can trust. No embassy that's going to believe a story this big without proof I can't safely deliver alone. My own newsroom nearly got me killed." She looked up and met his eyes, something in her chest finally settling into place, however unwillingly. "You're the safest thing in this city, and you're the head of a crime syndicate. Do you understand how insane that is?" "I understand it better than you think," he said quietly, finishing the bandage and setting her arm down with a care that lingered a beat too long. "I've spent 14 years being the last safe place for exactly no one. It's not a role I ever expected to hold twice." Something in the low light of the room, in the exhaustion pulling at both of them, in the quiet after violence, made the space between them feel smaller than it had any right to. Juliet studied the fading mark on his cheek, the ghost of her own hand still faintly visible if she looked closely enough, and felt something shift inside her chest that had nothing to do with fear. "Thank you," she said softly. "For tonight. For all of it." "Don't thank me yet," Yang Yun said, though his voice had gone rougher, warmer than before. "We haven't finished what we started." He held her gaze a moment longer than necessary, then rose, putting a careful distance back between them before either of them said something neither was ready for. "Rest. Tomorrow we move on the gala." The Cheongdam Gala was, on paper, a charity auction hosted by the city's deputy minister of trade in support of an orphanage that existed only in glossy pamphlets and a bank account Juliet's research had traced back through 4 shell companies to Park Min-soo himself. In person, it was a glittering sea of silk and diamonds inside a hotel ballroom draped in white orchids, string quartet playing somewhere beneath the chandelier's glow. Juliet moved through it in a midnight blue gown Yang Yun's staff had produced without explanation, her braids pinned into an elegant twist, a diamond choker at her throat that she suspected was worth more than she'd earned in the last 5 years combined. Beside her, Yang Yun wore the evening-like armor, effortlessly commanding the room's attention without ever raising his voice, his hand resting at the small of her back with a proprietary warmth that drew exactly the kind of assumptions they needed it to. "The safe is in the deputy minister's private office, 2nd floor," Juliet murmured against his ear as they moved through the crowd, her lips barely moving. "2 guards outside, camera on a 90-second loop." "I'll give you 3 minutes," Yang Yun said, guiding her toward the edge of the ballroom with a smile for the cameras that never touched his eyes. "After that, questions get asked." She peeled away from him near the terrace doors, slipping through a service corridor she'd memorized from blueprints 2 nights prior, her heels silent against the marble as she counted the camera's blind window in her head. The office door yielded to a lockpick kit tucked into her clutch, and the safe behind the false bookshelf took longer than she'd hoped, her hand steady despite the hammering of her pulse, until the final tumbler clicked and the door swung open on a slim stack of encrypted flash drives labeled in a code she recognized instantly from her research, auction manifests, buyer lists, shipment dates stretching 6 months into the future. She was sliding the drives into a hidden pocket sewn into her gown when raised voices reached her from the ballroom below, sharp enough to carry even through the office's heavy door. She found Yang Yun exactly where trouble had found him. Near the center of the dance floor, surrounded by 3 men she recognized from her files as Park Min-soo's senior lieutenants, their expressions carrying the particular blend of suspicion and menace that men wore when they'd noticed something wrong and hadn't yet decided how to handle it. Strange, one of them was saying, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear but pitched with an edge only Yang Yun would fully catch, seeing you at an event hosted by our associates, Yang Yun. Given recent tensions. I go where I'm invited, Yang Yun said easily, though Juliet, watching from the terrace doorway, could see the coiled readiness beneath his relaxed posture. As do you, apparently. And your companion? The lieutenant's eyes flicked past him, scanning the room, and Juliet's blood went cold as she realized he was looking for her specifically. We heard an interesting rumor. About a journalist who's been asking questions she shouldn't. Juliet stepped out from the terrace before she could think better of it, sliding her arm through Yang Yun's with a bright, practiced smile, the flash drives pressed flat and hidden against her ribs. Darling, there you are, she said, layering her voice with the kind of vapid warmth that made men like this dismiss a woman instantly. I was just admiring the view. Gorgeous city, isn't it? The lieutenant's eyes lingered on her a beat too long, calculating, and Juliet felt Yang Yun's arm tighten fractionally around hers, not fear, she realized, but readiness, the same coiled stillness she'd seen right before he'd broken 3 men's resolve in a hallway 2 nights before. Forgive us, Yang Yun said smoothly, already turning them both toward the exit. It's been a long evening, and my companion tires of business talk. Gentlemen. They made it to the valet stand without incident, though Juliet didn't fully release the breath she'd been holding until the car doors sealed shut around them and the hotel disappeared behind tinted glass. You have them, Yang Yun said, not a question, watching her hands finally shake now that the danger had passed. 6 months of manifests. Buyer names. Everything. Juliet met his eyes, something fierce and triumphant burning through her exhaustion. This is it. This is what ends him. Then let's make sure it reaches the right hands, Yang Yun said, and for the first time all evening, something like genuine hope crossed his face. The plan was simple, or as simple as anything had been since the night of the slap. A quiet transfer to a safe house near the Western Docks, where a contact from the international press consortium Juliet trusted with her life would receive the drives and begin the slow, careful work of building an unimpeachable case. Yang Yun's men swept the meeting point twice. Juliet arrived alone, as agreed, the drive sewn once more into a hidden pocket, her heart hammering with something that felt, for the first time in days, almost like hope. The ambush came from the water side, fast and silent, 3 black boats cutting their engines and drifting the final stretch to the dock under cover of fog rolling in off the harbor. Juliet barely had time to register the shapes moving toward her before a hand clamped over her mouth from behind and something hard and cold pressed into her ribs. Not a sound, a voice hissed in her ear, or I put a bullet through your spine right here. She was bound, blindfolded, and bundled onto one of the boats within seconds, the drives torn from their hidden pocket by rough hands before she could even think to fight for them. The last thing she heard before the engines roared to life was a voice she recognized from her research files, cold and satisfied, giving the order to move. Park Min-soo. She woke, or came back to full awareness, since she wasn't certain she'd ever fully lost consciousness. Bound to a chair on the deck of a yacht anchored somewhere off the coast, the blindfold gone, the cold sea air biting at her exposed arms. Floodlights blazed down from the yacht's upper deck, and a camera on a tripod stood angled directly at her face, its red recording light steady and merciless. Park Min-soo stood before her in an expensive suit that did nothing to soften the cruelty in his eyes, turning her stolen flash drives over in his fingers like a man admiring a trophy. Ms. Adeyemi, he said pleasantly, as if greeting her at a dinner party. You've caused my organization a remarkable amount of trouble for one woman with a recorder. Untie me and I'll cause you a lot more, Juliet said, forcing steel into her voice despite the fear coiling tight in her stomach. Minsu's smile didn't waver. I admire the spirit. It's a shame it won't survive the next hour. He gestured to the camera. You're going to die on this broadcast, Ms. Adeyemi, live to every rival syndicate contact I can reach, and Cho Yang Yun's name will be attached to every frame. A journalist under his protection, executed on his own turf. It'll look like exactly what I needed to look like, that he broke the neutrality agreements first. The gang war that follows will finish what tonight starts. Juliet's mind raced even as her face stayed carefully, deliberately calm. Beneath the rope binding her wrists, hidden in the underside of the bracelet Yang Yun had given her 2 nights before, a gift she'd assumed at the time was simple sentiment, an apology disguised as jewelry. A small transmitter had been quietly pulsing a location signal since the moment she'd been dragged onto this boat. She had no way to know if it was working. She had no way to know if help was coming at all. All she could do was stall, and keep Park Min-soo talking, and trust a man she'd known for less than 2 weeks with the only thing she had left. You should know, she said, lifting her chin despite the tremor in her voice, that Yang Yun isn't the only one who's been building a case against you. Everything on those drives has already been backed up. You kill me on camera, and the world sees exactly what you're trying to hide anyway. Something flickered behind Min-soo's eyes, not quite doubt, but close enough that Juliet allowed herself a small, private flare of satisfaction even bound to a chair on the deck of an enemy's yacht. He opened his mouth to respond, and that was the exact moment the first explosion tore through the night. The blast came from the yacht's stern, a controlled charge that sent 2 of Min-soo's men flying into the black water, and in the chaos that followed, 3 black speedboats emerged from the fog at full throttle, Yang Yun's tactical team already firing as they closed the distance. Juliet had never in her life been so glad to hear gunfire. Cut her loose. Someone shouted, and in the confusion, one of Min-soo's own men, panicked, desperate to be anywhere else, sliced through the rope at her wrists before fleeing toward the far rail. Juliet didn't waste the opportunity. She dove for the tripod, wrenched the camera around, and yanked the flash drives from Min-soo's loosened grip during the scramble, her fingers shaking as she jammed one into the broadcast unit's port with the desperate, focused speed of a woman who understood, better than anyone on that deck, exactly what those files could do. The yacht's satellite uplink was still live, still broadcasting, Min-soo's own vanity ensuring the feed reached every screen he'd intended to use against Yang Yun. Juliet rerouted it in seconds, years of technical training kicking in beneath the adrenaline, and sent the entire trafficking ledger, manifests, buyer names, shipment routes, 6 months of evidence, streaming live to 3 international news agencies and a law enforcement server she'd bookmarked for exactly this kind of desperate, last-resort moment. What are you doing? Min-soo roared, lunging for her, and then Yang Yun was there, crashing across the deck like something unleashed, driving his shoulder into Min-soo's chest and taking them both to the ground in a tangle of fists and fury 3 years in the making. The fight that followed was brutal and short. Whatever restraint Yang Yun had shown in the hallway back at his estate was entirely absent now, every blow carrying the full weight of a debt owed to a sister who never came home, of months spent dismantling a network piece by piece while its architect hid behind diplomatic protection and neutrality laws. Min-soo got in one solid hit before Yang Yun ended it, a final strike that dropped the rival boss to the deck and left him there, dazed and bleeding, as Yang Yun's men swarmed the yacht and secured every corner of it within minutes. Yang Yun turned from Min-soo's prone form and found Juliet exactly where he'd left her, standing at the broadcast console, the last of the files still uploading, her whole body trembling with the aftershock of adrenaline finally draining away. He crossed the deck in 3 strides and pulled her into him without a word, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other pressed flat against her spine as if he could physically hold her together through sheer proximity. You're safe, he murmured against her hair, his voice rough in a way she'd never heard from him before. It's done. You're safe. I got it all out, Juliet managed, her voice muffled against his chest, relief and exhaustion crashing over her in equal measure. Every drive. It's already live. There's no burying this now. He pulled back just far enough to look at her, his hands framing her face with a gentleness that stood in stark contrast to the blood still on his knuckles. You did that, he said quietly. Bound to a chair, staring down a man who wanted you dead on camera, and you still found a way to win. I had help, Juliet said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it entirely. 6 weeks later, Park Min-soo's trial dominated headlines across 3 continents, the evidence Juliet had risked her life to broadcast forming the backbone of an international prosecution that reached into ministries and shipping conglomerates far beyond Seoul. Her name ran beneath the byline of the story that broke it all open, syndicated to outlets she'd once only dreamed of writing for, and offers poured in from newsrooms in New York, London, and Washington, each one promising the kind of career she'd sacrificed everything to build. She turned every one of them down. She stood now on the terrace of Yang Yun's estate, the same gardens she'd first glimpsed through a car window on the worst night of her life, now soft with early evening light and the quiet hum of a household no longer under siege. Cho Yang Yun stepped out to join her, 2 glasses of wine in hand, the mark her palm had left on his cheek so long ago now nothing but a memory neither of them had forgotten. Your editor's replacement called again this morning, he said, handing her a glass. The New York bureau chief. 3rd time this week. I know. Juliet took the wine, looking out over the gardens rather than at him. I told her I'm staying in Seoul. You could still take the offer. Report from here. There's no rule that says home has to be the reason you came, rather than the reason you stay. That's not why I'm staying, Juliet said, finally turning to face him, something steady and certain settling over features that had spent the last 2 months learning to trust again. I came to this city to expose one trafficking network. I'm staying because I found something I never expected to find in the process, a partner who trusted me with the truth even when it cost him, and a place where I stopped being someone hiding from her own story and started being someone standing inside it. Yang Yun set his glass down on the stone railing, closing the distance between them with the same quiet certainty he'd carried since the night he'd raised his hand and stopped his own men from ending her life before it had truly begun. The Biko syndicate answers to me, he said softly, but it respects strength, and it has watched you walk through fire without flinching for 2 months now. You're not a guest in this house anymore, Juliet. Haven't been for some time. Then what am I? She asked, though something in her chest already knew the answer, had known it perhaps since the moment his hand had come up in that crowded club, palm out, choosing her over everything he'd built. Whatever you want to be, he said, reaching up to brush a stray braid from her cheek, his hand lingering there. My equal. My partner. The only person in this city who ever hit me and made me grateful for it. Juliet laughed then, the sound breaking free of her for the first time in what felt like years, unguarded and real, and when Yang Yun leaned down to close the last distance between them, she met him halfway, no longer the reckless reporter who trusted no one, but a woman standing exactly where she'd chosen to be, beside the king of Seoul's underworld, no longer hunted, no longer hiding, finally, entirely home.